Thinking Tactically is a paid program. The information provided is not legal advice and should not be used in lieu of legal counsel. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and their guests are not necessarily those of West Coast Armory North or this station.
Every day, we hear stories of innocent people who are the victims of violent crimes. Do you want to leave your personal defense up to someone else? Or take the initiative and be responsible and prepared to defend yourself and your family? If you answered yes, this is the show for you. Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. And now, here are your hosts, John Holshin and Kevin Smith.
Good morning and welcome to Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. I'm Kevin Smith.
And this is John Holshin.
All right, John, we're going to jump right into it today with what are some of the lessons we have from the news today.
So the first story comes out of King County, Washington. A frequent customer was in the store getting his coffee around 5:45 in the morning when a masked man armed with a hatchet walks into the store and just starts attacking the clerk. Didn't say anything whatsoever. They don't know if it was intended to be a robbery or what, but this guy just walks in with a hatchet and lays into the clerk. The concealed carry permit holder draws his firearm and fatally shoots the assailant. One of the statements there from the law enforcement spokesman was that, says, this is a quote, "We believe had this Good Samaritan not acted, we might have had a dead clerk on our hands right now." So a case where a concealed carry permit holder was faced with just out of the blue, instantaneously going from, drinking your coffee, trying to, if he's anything like me in the morning, there he was just trying to get caffeinated. And
just trying to wake up.
There you go. Just trying to wake up. And boom, right there in front of you, there's somebody getting hacked to death with a hatchet, basically. Second one is a man that went to a designated meeting spot to purchase a dirt bike, something that had been arranged on one of the community sales type forums, and actually what it was a setup for a robbery. So he was armed, and when the guy attempted to rob him, he ended up drawing his firearm and engaging the guy. The attempted robber ended up dead. Third case is a man in the drive-thru at a McDonald's restaurant at lunchtime, a man and his 4-year-old son. When an individual walks up to him, his window's down already. He's actually in the process of ordering. It's all caught on videotape. This guy walks up, sticks a gun in the window, and starts telling him to get out of the truck. He ends up drawing his, again, legally carried concealed firearm and engage in the bad guy. So in all three of these cases, it turned out that the bad guy did die. Of course, when we use deadly force to defend ourselves, the intent is not to cause his death, as it is to get him to stop threatening our life. But anytime you use deadly force, you have to recognize that death is a likely possibility, obviously.
Well, and this is 2 weeks in a row that we've had an incident with firearms at a McDonald's. I love my McDonald's, but should I be concerned going down to McDonald's these days?
Well, I don't want to pick on McDonald's. These things happen everywhere. And that's really, what I pulled out here, these three stories, and just giving you, that brief overview. The point here is that sometimes we fall into this habit of thinking about when we should carry a gun or when we should be alert, when we go to, quote, bad places. If I'm going to the bad part of town, or just the other way around, I don't need to take my gun on this trip because I'm not really going anywhere risky.
Well, and as these situations indicate, every situation has the potential to turn risky. I mean, you're at 7-Eleven at 5 a.m. in the morning just trying to get your coffee, trying to roll out. You're just trying to get in the front of the line and get out of there, but obviously something happens where a very interesting individual obviously comes in with a hatchet of all things, and then you end up in a situation where you're having to defend someone's life.
Exactly, and that's really the theme here, if you haven't already guessed it this morning, is just that we really can't predict. If we could predict, we'd just stay home. At least that would be my approach. If I could predict where the problem would be, I just wouldn't be there. But if we make decisions about concealed carry based on what we expect, well, obviously common sense says that we can adequately assess some situations as being more risky than others. But many of these situations, again, we're dealing with people that are insane in some cases, probably the hatchet-wielding guy, considering he didn't even make a robbery statement. He just walked in swinging a hatchet. you think about, where are people going to rob you? Well, the guy was 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the McDonald's drive-through with his 4-year-old son. That's not a bad part of town. He's not thinking that, this is a high-risk situation. Maybe the guy that's taking a bunch of cash to go meet somebody he doesn't know to buy something, that might kind of make you think twice about it. But what I'd like you to think about here is that we really can't predict. To me, if you believe that you should have a firearm, if you believe that it's appropriate for you to have a firearm to carry on your person at any time, it really leads me to think that it's appropriate to have a firearm on your person all of the time.
Well, and it just comes down to, if that's something that you've chosen as part of your life is to be involved in carrying a firearm with you in certain situations, what is it that you're making is the distinction as to why, when you're going to this place, you need to have a firearm, but if you're going to this place over here, I don't need to there. What makes any of those situations more dangerous than the other? When, as we pointed out, bad things can happen anywhere. Bad things can happen in great situations where you think everything's safe, and then great things can happen where nothing goes wrong in the worst part of town. So it's about determining if that's what you want to do and that's your belief is that you want to carry for your protection there. It's better to carry all the time versus being in the situation where this is the time I didn't bring it and I need it. That's
my approach. and that's really what I'm bringing out today is for everybody's consideration is that if you do conceal carry, really think about if you're currently picking and choosing when you carry. To me, you're going to take care of some of the situations, but there's just as likely that the situation that you may be faced with is not something that you can predict.
Yeah. I do want to, if I'm able to change the direction a little bit here, I want to go back to the second incident that you talked about with the guy who met the individual for the dirt bike and just kind of address that area of meeting somebody that you don't know online and just a little bit of advice there on, obviously he's meeting with a dirt bike. So my guess is that he met somewhere a little bit more secluded with the environment because he wanted to maybe test ride the motorbike or something.
Yeah, there's none of that information in the article, unfortunately. Nothing there that tells us where he met, other than that it was it actually says a quiet West Side neighborhood. I really don't know the exact, where it took place as far as whether it was a predictable type thing. But I mean, he does say that it was, as usual, whether you're talking Craigslist or whatever, people try and meet at a relatively neutral location. So that's he did say that they were going to a neutral location to meet to look at the bike.
Yeah, which is at least smart in that aspect. Another place that I know you can go to meet there is actually meet at the police station. It's guaranteed to be probably one of the safest places that you can, and they're not going to be upset if you're meeting outside the police station to sell your Xbox and somebody's buying, that sort of idea. If you're looking for somewhere safe and you're concerned about that, obviously you never want to have a complete stranger come to your home to buy something because that shows them what's in your home, where you live, and they can come back and potentially rob your house when you're not there, and you just don't want random strangers knowing where you're at and what you're selling and what you have in your home.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. That's I've actually used that same methodology and looked around and actually chose which police station based on, they had a nice, good-sized parking lot that always had spaces available, and you could get in there and you're right adjacent to the police station, yet you're not. Some police stations right on a real busy traffic road or something, but with a little forethought. And if that's something that you engage in regularly, if you use Craigslist or that sort of thing, I think it makes sense to look around and find your favorite meeting points and with security in mind.
Yeah. And like I said, the law enforcement are never going to get upset if you're meeting in your parking lot trying to be safe. They're going to understand. They're going to be able to, give you some advice on how to do it, but they're not going to kick you out because you're trying to do something lawfully in a safe manner.
No, that's absolutely correct. And you actually, I teach, one of the locations that I teach at quite a bit is a community center that's in a building that also is the police headquarters. And one of the things that we, observed early on is how many of the custody transfers, divorced parents that have joint custody, and in situations where there may have been some domestic violence or some security concerns, at times the court or the social workers will suggest or require that the transfer take place on the property of the police station, for example. So they're actually used to people coming up, parking, getting out and talking and exchanging, in this case, children, but that activity that we're talking about with sales will just fit right in. It's not going to be an unusual thing that is going to stand out in the law enforcement officers coming in and out.
Yeah. Well, and when we were talking about that, I really thought that giving some advice on that subject of how to best keep yourself safe would be useful. And, as you pointed out, it's going back to the subject of the firearms and carrying all the time. If you're going to carry, it's better to carry when you're all the time out there versus making those selective, if I'm going to this part of town, I'm carrying. If I'm going to this part, I'm not. Obviously, we're not telling you to carry into places that you aren't legally allowed to carry, but just be aware of bad things can potentially happen anywhere. So you just need to be aware and alert. We're going to take a quick break here, and when we return, we're going to be talking about
legalities of self-defense.
All right. You're listening to Thinking Tactically right here on Fox Sports 1380.
You're listening to Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. Brought to you in part by West Coast Armory North, providing expert personalized service to each individual client. For more information, log on to westcoastarmorynorth.com. Insights Training Center is locally owned and nationally recognized and offers the most complete self-defense, firearms, and tactical training available to civilians and private organizations, law enforcement, and military. In business for over 20 years, they've taught more than 20,000 private citizens, law enforcement officers, instructors, SWAT teams, corrections personnel, security officers, and military personnel, offering classes from basic self-defense and handgun safety to advanced tactic classes and everything in between. Insights Training Center has a course for you. Their professional instructors come from highly specialized and thorough backgrounds in law enforcement, military special operations, and the private sector. Visit InsightsTraining.com for a complete list of upcoming classes.
Every day, there are men and women of our armed forces dealing with illness and injuries, and their families are unable to be by their side. Fisher House works to get the families of injured military members to their soldiers during these difficult times. They provide housing and transportation to help make certain our soldiers are not alone. Visit fisherhouse.org to see how you can make a difference in the lives of the brave men and women of our armed forces that have sacrificed so much for us. Those of us at Thinking Tactically and West Coast Armory North are proud to support Fisher House.
Taking responsibility out of someone else's hands and putting it into yours. This is Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. And now, back to more of the show. Here are your hosts, John Holshin and Kevin Smith.
All right, welcome back to Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. So, John, we're going to talk a little bit about the legalities of self-defense and help our listeners get a better understand. Hopefully, we can get some people to understand a little bit more about what they can and can't do with self-defense. So what do you got to start with us?
Well, first, the requisite disclaimer. I am not an attorney, and this is not legal advice. So we get that out there right up front.
This will not hold up in the court of law in any way, shape, or form.
Correct. So why do I feel that I am appropriate to speak on this topic at all? I've been trained by a bunch of attorneys to be a expert on the legal use of self-defense. I have served as an expert witness in a number of cases and have gone through a number of training programs to help me understand this. Again, I'm not a lawyer. It's kind of like I'm not a doctor, but I've had a bunch of first aid classes, so I can talk to you about first aid. Well, this is kind of the first aid level of the legalities of self-defense. So, one of the issues is you can go down all kinds of rabbit holes with this. You can get into, people immediately want to talk about the exceptions. And what I really want to talk about today is I want to talk about planning, thinking about how your thoughts about the legality of self-defense impact on your planning, on your, I've talked about visualization, mental preparation, scenario-based training, even if it's only in your mind, and how we think about the legalities shape how we think about those situations. So one of the things that I try and get people to do right off is don't think about the exceptions, think about the generalities. Let's try and stay in the middle of the road, not worry about if we get one wheel off the road, can we recover it or not. That's kind of the analogy. I want to think about, okay, what type of mental preparation with legalities of self-defense will keep me in the middle of the road where I'm not likely to end up in court. We can talk about, this exception or that exception. And when you go to research those, you find things like Washington State Supreme Court case. I don't want to be a Washington State Supreme Court case. I want to be a situation that I don't end up in court at all.
You want to be that one where the prosecutor takes a look at it and that's the extent of it. No charges brought.
Exactly. So the way my personal guidelines for the use of lethal force parallel very much a man by the name of Massad Ayoob, who is one of the people that I trained with. And Massad is arguably the foremost expert in the United States on the civilian use of deadly force, and it does differ from law enforcement deadly force in a number of ways. And I'm just going to read you a little quote from Ayoob. He says, the use of lethal force that can end in homicide, so deadly force, is justified in a situation of immediate, otherwise unavoidable danger of death or grave bodily harm to the innocent. So what we're talking about here is only a situation that if you don't use deadly force, you or someone else are going to die or be seriously harmed. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, John. I've read, actually, the Washington Administrative Code, and it talks about preventing felonies or in the resistance of a felony. And it seems like I could use deadly force in a lot more situations. And you probably could. But again, I can lead you through 3 or 4 of those that ended up as Washington State Supreme Court cases, because when it gets down to it, the court has to decide whether your actions were reasonable and necessary. And if you're using deadly force to prevent loss of property, for example, well, that might be a felony. So on the surface of it, reading the WAC, the Washington Administrative Code, or the RCW, the Revised Code of Washington, it talks about the fact that you can use deadly force to not be victimized by a felony, or that's what it appears to say. So then how come we end up with these things ending up in the state Supreme Court if it's that cut and dried? The fact is it isn't that cut and dried. So what my suggestion, again, is in all of my planning, I plan to use deadly force only if I or someone else's life is in deadly danger.
Well, and it goes to that whole argument of, is property worth taking someone's life for?
And there we get to the morality of it as well, and that's certainly very appropriate. But to stay on the legal side for a moment, so there's a term we used here, grave bodily harm, death or grave bodily harm. So what's the definition of grave bodily harm? Well, we already can get into some gray areas here. According to one historical jury directive in Washington State, it is an injury that creates a probability of death or significant serious permanent disfigurement or significant permanent loss of impairment or function of a bodily part or organ. Notice all of this says permanent. Okay? Another court case, the court states that the injury is of a more serious nature than an ordinary striking with hands or fists.
So fist fight's not going to do it for you.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, that case involved 3 assailants against the one defender that end up accused of a deadly weapon charge. And that ended up in the state Supreme Court. You might say, well, wait a minute, John, I've heard about this thing, disparity of force. Yep, disparity of force is a real legal concept. But here's a case that had to go all the way to the Washington Supreme Court, and it did not work out well for the defender in this case. He was convicted. The conviction was later overturned on a different technicality, but the fact of the matter is, the original ruling of the Supreme Court. And again, I don't often read to you, but I think it's important to hear some of these things directly. So here's a quote from that legal finding. It says, when there is no reasonable ground for the person attacked or apparently under attack to believe that he's in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm, if it appears that only an ordinary battery is all that is intended, in other words, they're going to beat you up, he has no right to repel that threatened assault by the use of a deadly weapon in a deadly manner. You have the right to use force, according to the Washington State Supreme Court in this case, but not the right to use deadly force if somebody's going to beat you up, even if 3 people are going to beat you up. According to this Washington Supreme Court case, they did not find that sufficient for this man to use a deadly weapon to repel that assault. So just, there's some things to think about here. It really, again, yes, you might prevail in the end. After how many years in the courts? After what expense? And we really come back to one of the situations in this case was that the individual that ultimately ended up defending himself had multiple opportunities to take actions other than deadly force prior to getting in that position. So we really, if we walk around with the idea that, if I get into this situation, I'm just going to pull my gun, you may end up in some very serious legal issues.
Well, and that's what we've talked about in the past is with having that perfect defense. You don't want to have it as a muddied potential there. You want to make sure that your defense is going to hold up 100%, that everything you did is in the right. You didn't say some things to him beforehand. You didn't skip the opportunity to leave a situation, and that you were 100% in your defense.
Exactly. And this is about where in the conversation, when I'm having this conversation in class, someone inevitably raises their hands and says, wait a minute, I thought I didn't have any duty to retreat. I thought I didn't have to leave. You may not have to leave, but the whole totality of the circumstance is going to be taken into account by the prosecutor and the courts and the appellate courts. And no, it wasn't a legal requirement to leave, but it is a legal requirement that your force be no more than is reasonable and necessary. And those two words, reasonable and necessary, actually have, although they are subjective, they are based on what you believe, there's an objective component in that what's called the reasonable man doctrine. Would the typical person have thought? Will the 12 members of the jury think? Does the prosecutor believe that 12 members of the jury will believe that what you did was not reasonable and necessary? Because if the prosecutor doesn't think it was reasonable and necessary, and he doesn't think 12 members of a jury will believe that it was reasonable and necessary, he's likely to prosecute you, to take you to court.
And at the very least, you're looking at significant amount of time, money, resources on your part to defend yourself.
Exactly. And in the end, it may turn out that, in fact, the jury decides in your favor. My point really here is that I'd like to think about this stuff in advance, not allow my ego or any other considerations to put me in a situation where a prosecutor is going to doubt the reasonableness and the necessity of my actions and attempt to convince the members of a jury that in fact, what I did was not reasonable and necessary. I want to plan ahead, think ahead, and avoid those situations.
So when you're talking about planning ahead, thinking ahead, what type of mindset or ways do you need to be conducting yourself so that you're prepared for proper self-defense, I guess?
One of the first things that I think of is it was actually, as I think I've mentioned it before on the show, a science fiction writer, but nevertheless, there's a lot of truth in his words. And the statement is that an armed society is a polite society. And you may have seen that in various places. And sometimes people get in the mindset that, well, that means if everybody knows I'm armed, they'll be more polite to me. Maybe. That means they'd have to know you're armed and a bunch of other things. The way I look at it is what it means is if I am armed, I'm required to be polite. I'm required to be very polite, even to people that might not really deserve politeness. Because if this thing deteriorates to a point where I believe I'm in deadly danger, the totality of the circumstance is going to be looked at. And if I've uttered fighting words, if my impoliteness has risen to a level of incitement, all of that is going to prejudice my defense. All of that is then going to bring into question my reasonableness, my state of mind at the time. And so starting off by, the turn the other cheek type of thing, the realization that I'm not out there to enforce the laws. And if I see someone committing a crime, if that crime does not involve the loss of life, my behavior while armed should be exactly what my behavior would be if not armed. What does that mean? The majority of the time, it's to be a really good witness. Right?
Call 911.
Yep. Gather the necessary information and call 911 and make the report. To do the exact same thing that I would do if I was not armed.
Okay.
So, I've used that term reasonableness a number of times. And, question is, are there any guidelines for a jury or for the prosecutor to look at in terms of determining reasonableness? And absolutely there are. And this comes back to something we've talked about a bit before, but in case you didn't hear it, and it's always good to have a reminder, there's different acronyms or different outlines for this. I use the one that I originally learned it in, which kind of goes back to Old English common law, and that's the concepts of ability, opportunity, and jeopardy. And in terms of determining your reasonableness, the prosecutor, the courts, the jury would be instructed to look at these three factors. Ability, we're talking about all of these factors, how they relate to the person that I have used force against, the person that I'm saying I had to use deadly force against. They're going to look at it and say, did that person have the ability to cause my death or grave bodily harm, serious bodily injury, words to that effect. This injury that is more than that caused by typical hands or fists. Right?
Yeah.
So what's that ability? Most of the time it's a weapon. And those are the most cut and dried. They have some form of weapon, whether it's a firearm, whether it's a knife, whether it's a baseball bat, whether it's a piece of rebar. They have a tool that clearly gives them the ability to cause injury to me that could cause my death or that could harm me permanently, where generally fists and open hands are not considered likely to do that. So, number one, do they have that ability to cause me permanent injury or death? Number two, do they have the opportunity to use their ability? That is usually simply distance related. If somebody's far away with a contact distance weapon, they're on the other side of a busy street waving a knife around, saying they're going to cut your heart out, they might have the opportunity in the next moment or three, but I probably shouldn't be shooting them across the street. They are not yet in a position where they can imminently apply that ability they have to cause me that injury.
And you should have some time to be able to run in the other direction.
There you go.
The
Contact distance weapon. Can I get behind a locked door? Can I just open up the distance? Various things, right, that would allow me to not have to use deadly force. Whether I have a duty to retreat or not, I don't want to kill someone. If I kill someone, it's not going to be a better day
for anybody
today or tomorrow than it was yesterday. Having said that, I know that I would absolutely not hesitate to use deadly force when necessary. But my point is, I set my standard of if I can get away from it, it wasn't necessary. So I'm going to try and move away from it if I can. Obviously, if he is too close, or I would put myself at greater risk to move away, well, then it's not practical to move away. And that isn't a possibility. Third is jeopardy, the third criteria. First was ability, second is opportunity, third is jeopardy. Jeopardy really is where reasonableness comes to a real crux. Would a reasonable person, knowing what you knew at the time, believe that they were imminently, that means in the next moment, that this person was going to use their ability and their opportunity to put you in jeopardy? Or by their actions, are they already or imminently about to use their ability and their opportunity to cause you this harm? Because up until then, it's only theoretical. You go to the bank and that armed guard standing there in the lobby, he has ability and opportunity to harm you. Of course he's not going to harm you. You're not in jeopardy at all. But he's standing there armed. A police officer with a firearm has ability and opportunity to cause harm. But he is not going to be randomly using that ability and opportunity on people. No one's in jeopardy. If you go to a shooting range, there are people around with firearms. They have ability and opportunity to harm people, but their behavior is in no way indicating that anyone is in any jeopardy. So mere ability and opportunity by itself actually provide nothing in terms of a concern for self-defense. It only becomes a concern for self-defense when actions are involved. Actions also include what people say. Obviously, a verbal threat, I'm going to kill you. Oh, well, that kind of makes things clear.
Especially when they have a gun in their hand.
Exactly. You have ability, you have opportunity, and you have a statement or a behavior. So that's really where we come down to then is what are they doing that makes us believe, that would make a reasonable person believe that they are in imminent jeopardy. And all three of those things need to be present simultaneously. And if they're present simultaneously, that meets a subjective, objective standard of reasonableness. And at that point, the prosecutor is unlikely to think that your behavior was unreasonable. And even if even if he might have a political agenda or might be anti-gun, he has to think about, can I convince 12 members of a jury that these actions were unreasonable? No, because the defense can show that these three criteria were present. Therefore, the homicide, which would normally be a crime, was justifiable because of the laws of self-defense.
Yep. So remember, it's ability, opportunity, and jeopardy. Are you in jeopardy of bodily harm, severe bodily harm that is permanent or death?
You got it.
We're going to take a quick break here, so stay with us. You're listening to Thinking Tactically, Personal Security for Today's World, right here on Fox Sports 1380.
You're listening to Thinking Tactically, Personal Security for Today's World. Brought to you in part by Insights Training Center, offering the most complete self-defense, firearms, and tactical training available to citizens, private organizations, law enforcement, and military. Online at insightstraining.com.
The Northwest Women's Shooting Network is a comprehensive resource in person and online for all women's shooting needs and questions. Everything from basic education to continuing education, we are here to help you find and buy the right gun for you, get the proper skills for personal protection, and to create a welcome and safe environment to learn with other women. Coming from over 30 years of combined experience in the shooting industry, we are mothers, sisters, wives, and just plain awesome gals. In other words, just like you. Our commitment is to help you become an informed, skilled, confident woman. We are based out of West Coast Armory North in Everett, Washington, minutes north of Seattle. We offer a variety of events, seminars, training, and more. Already we have hosted a variety of events such as Kids Safety Day, Ladies Night Out, and shopping events. And we also hold regular women-only classes in addition to our Ladies Shooting Club and Ladies League. At the range, we have over 70 rental firearms for you to try before you buy, and every Thursday is Ladies Day. Find us at westcoastarmorynorth.com under the Women's Network tab and on Facebook at Northwest Women's Shooting Network.
The trauma of war does not end when the guns stop firing. Many servicemen and women who come home from war face life-changing issues. These issues can affect not only them, but their families and friends. If you or someone you know is struggling with PTSD, know you are not alone. Veterans Affairs has resources and information available to help our brave soldiers. Go to ptsd.va.gov to learn how they can help.
Welcome back to the radio show dedicated to information and education about defending yourself. Thinking tactically, personal security for today's world. Once again, here are your hosts, John Holshin and Kevin Smith.
All right, welcome back. You're listening to Thinking Tactically right here on Fox Sports 1380. So, John, I know we've talked about when observing a crime, being a good witness in that process for helping law enforcement in that way. So I guess a question that I have is, if you're observing something and you see, say, a law enforcement officer looks like they're in some serious trouble or they could use some help, what are your thoughts on when is it ever appropriate? What is the opportunity where going and trying to help law enforcement?
Those are great questions. In many cases, law enforcement works in situations where they don't have immediate backup. You might be in a more rural situation where backup is many minutes away. Even in an urban environment where backup is only a few minutes away, a few minutes is forever in a fight, let alone a deadly force encounter. So, I've seen a number of news stories of situations where citizens have helped police officers that were in serious trouble under assault. And in every circumstance, the police officer has been very happy to have that help when they were interviewed after the fact. Some of those are deadly, some are not. But there's some things to consider there. And the first is the cop doesn't know who you are. If the cop is in a fight, whether that's fisticuffs or becoming more serious, if he's skilled enough, experienced enough, adroit enough to still be scanning his environment, sees you coming up in a hurry, he doesn't know if you're coming to help him or you're coming to help the other guy.
He probably thinks that it's another assailant
It
coming
could
in.
be, right. And if he isn't, if he's so involved in the immediate fight, he's not even going to be aware that you're there possibly, because we all tunnel vision in until that really impacts him. So, we need to address that issue. So the first step is identification, is the way I look at it. The first step is to identify myself. And there's kind of two branches here. One is a situation where it very clearly appears to be, deadly force. I mean, if bullets are already flying, that's one thing. But even there, I'm taking cover is the first thing that I'm doing. It takes time to get a gun out. And what are you doing during that time? So, there's always that danger. We don't want to be mistaken by the police officer or other responding officers as one of the bad guys. So my immediate thing is identification. I'm either going to say, "Officer, I have a concealed pistol license. Do you need help?" Or I'm simply going to say, "Officer, do you need help?" One of those two things. I'm either going to announce that I have a concealed pistol license, "Do you need help?" Or simply ask him, "Do you need help?" If I think the situation is bordering on deadly force, I'm going to state I have a concealed pistol license. Why? Because the vast majority of times, a private citizen, you may look at this thing and think, wow, that's really a heck of a fight. In fact, most of the time, what law enforcement officers tell me is the bad guy they're fighting really isn't trying to harm them as much as he is trying to get away. The fight is one of restraint, and the officer knows deadly force is not appropriate, right? He does not want you pulling a gun out or inserting yourself in a situation because you have a gun. This isn't a gun situation. If he needs help, he may say something like, "Yeah, grab his arms or lay on his legs or hold him for a moment," while the officer retrieves his lost handcuffs, for example. And that's really the only level of force that's appropriate. And he needs to know that you know that and you're not thinking about getting a gun out. And also, there's been cases where a citizen has intervened, he has used deadly force, and the officer is left in a situation saying, "Yeah, I asked for help. I didn't mean for him to shoot the guy." It wasn't a shoot situation. It wasn't deadly force. So those are, I need to let him know I'm the good guy. And unless you're really highly trained, and even if you are, I think it's appropriate to let the officer kind of have an idea of where you are in this thing. So I don't want to come up in a wrestling match and really announce that I have a concealed pistol license, because if I was a cop, I'd be going, does this guy realize this is a wrestling match, not a shooting event?
Yeah.
So
you want the cop to believe, and you want to have an understanding of reasonableness.
Exactly. There we go. Back to reasonableness again. So step number 1 is identify. Now, saying, "Officer, do you need help?" helps him identify me as a good guy. The bad guy who's coming up to beat him up doesn't need to deceive him, or that's coming up to help the man he's fighting with is unlikely to be trying to deceive him. So he's unlikely to come up and ask, "Officer, do you need help?" So right there, we're beginning to identify ourselves as what? The good guy, the potential helper for the officer. And then, depending on what the officer says, he may say, "No, stand back." "Yes, sir. I'll stand back and be a good witness." And that's that. Or he may say yes and give you some guidance. So those are the first 2 steps. If you do find yourself in a deadly force situation where you have had to, or a situation where you have drawn your weapon, whether you have fired it or not, holster it again at the first opportunity and put it back into concealment. Why? Because the responding officer's coming onto the scene, particularly if the call has gone out that this officer needs help, they don't know for sure what's going on. They don't know if it turned deadly and the officer hasn't had a chance to convey that information. So they see you standing there with a gun in your hand. What are they reasonably going to expect?
That you are the one that the police officer called for help because of.
Exactly. So that is quite reasonable for them to expect that, depending upon your behavior. So in your behavior, you need to not look threatening. What's the best way to not look threatening? Don't have a gun in your hand.
Don't have it visible.
There you go. So if I did have to get my gun out, I'm going to reholster it at the first opportunity. As soon as it is safe to do so, we want to reholster the gun and put it back into concealment to reduce that chance that you're going to be mistaken for the bad guy. Up until that point, I need to have my head on a swivel, think about where it's likely the police officers are coming from, and be telling myself, if I hear the command, "Police, drop the weapon," that I'm going to freeze in place, followed by dropping the weapon. Every once in a while I get somebody in class that says, "Well, how do you know it's a cop?" Honestly, that's a pretty silly question if you really stop to think about it. If the bad guy is there, under what circumstances would the bad guy tell you to drop the weapon rather than just shooting you? Pretty small likelihood that the bad guy is going to take the time to pretend to be a cop to get me to drop a weapon that I've just shot his associate, his partner with. He's just going to shoot you. He's not going to pretend to be a cop.
Well, especially if they're at a situation where they're harming a police officer to the point where he needs your help to draw a firearm and get a firearm involved, they're probably not concerned with collateral damage of a regular citizen.
Exactly. So I program myself in advance. This is one of the scenarios I run through in any circumstance where I've got a gun in my hand and I hear somebody say, "Police, drop the weapon." That's what I'm going to do. All right.
And that makes sense.
Yeah. So, and absolutely here in this case, because we know the cops are on the way, we know backup is on the way. So just to recap, number 1, identify and ask. Those are the 2 steps that work together. Identify and ask. Simply the asking often identifies you as a good guy willing to help. Officer, do you need help? If you believe that deadly force is appropriate and you have time, "Officer, I have a concealed pistol license. Do you need help?" That will inform the officer of what you think is going on and give him the opportunity to react to you. That also, should a legal situation ensue after this, whether it's criminal or civil, you have the statement of the police officer that may have been picked up on the radio and by witnesses that addresses the reasonableness of your action. Second big concern is don't be mistaken for a bad guy. Put your gun away, keep looking for responding officers, and as soon as you are contacted by law enforcement, do exactly what they say and everything they say. Don't try and tell them, I'm just helping. That'll all work out in a moment. Do what they say. You expect that you may be detained. You may be handcuffed. They're coming into this situation, particularly if there's an officer seriously injured. They're trying to get the situation stabilized to the point they can get an ambulance in and get him out of there. Just realize they can't see your halo. They don't necessarily know you're the good guy. Expect the worst. Be pleasantly surprised if it all works out better. But expect to be handcuffed. Expect to be questioned. And it'll all work out. But in the heat of the moment is not the time to try and argue with the cops or explain what's going on. So another thing to think about is, what about that situation? It's not deadly force. Maybe there's a small group of people that are gathered around that aren't harming the officer, not part of it, but they're not acting. They don't know what to do. And maybe, your physical abilities, you're not sure if you have the ability to get in there and help. Consider enlisting the crowd or bystanders. Often there are multiple people there that would like to help. They just don't know how. They don't know how to get started. At that point, I turn to the crowd, turn to the people there and say, that officer needs help, and see, does anybody step forward with me? Then as I move, either I've already told the officer, ask the officer, do you need help? Turn to the others, that officer needs help. I'll grab his arm. You grab that other arm. You lay on his legs.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So think about enlisting if there are other bystanders that look like they're willing, but just maybe don't know how to get started. Take charge a little bit, and just, it can be real simple. You grab that arm, I'll grab this arm.
Yep.
All right. So hopefully that's given you some ideas to think about if you're ever in that kind of situation. Again, preparation, pre-planning, thinking through situations in advance, thinking about what might happen and what your actions would be, allow you to make decisions, to make plans that, should you ever find yourself in a circumstance, even if it is not exactly what you have imagined, hypothesized, or thought through, hopefully it's close enough that you can modify the plan slightly and still have an effective response.
All right, sounds good. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Thinking Tactically right here on Fox Sports 1380.
You're listening to Thinking Tactically.
Personal security for today's world.
Heard every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. on Fox Sports 1380. Once again, here are your hosts, John Holshin and Kevin Smith. Insights Training Center is locally owned and nationally recognized and offers the most complete self-defense, firearms, and tactical training available to civilians and private organizations, law enforcement, and military. In business for over 20 years, they've taught more than 20,000 private citizens, law enforcement officers, instructors, SWAT teams, corrections personnel, security officers, and military personnel, offering classes from basic self-defense and handgun safety to advanced tactic classes and everything in between. Insights Training Center has a course for you. Their professional instructors come from highly specialized and thorough backgrounds in law enforcement, military special operations, and the private sector. Visit InsightsTraining.com for a complete list of upcoming classes.
Every day, there are men and women of our armed forces dealing with illness and injuries, and their families are unable to be by their side. Fisher House works to get the families of injured military members to their soldiers during these difficult times. They provide housing and transportation to help make certain our soldiers are not alone. Visit fisherhouse.org to see how you can make a difference in the lives of the brave men and women of our armed forces that have sacrificed so much for us. Those of us at Thinking Tactically and West Coast Armory North are proud to support Fisher House.
Taking responsibility out of someone else's hands and putting it into yours. This is Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. And now, back to more of the show. Here are your hosts, John Holshin and Kevin Smith.
All right, welcome back to Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. We're now going to talk about the difference between practice ammunition and self-defense ammunition or defense ammunition. So, John, what really makes the difference?
Well, there's a couple of factors involved. For practice ammunition, one, I'd like it to be inexpensive because I'd like to practice a fair amount. I think anyone who carries a gun regularly or considers having a gun for self-defense, in the way I think, once a month is pretty much the minimum. I think that people ought to go and shoot once a month. And people say, well, wait a minute, cops only do it once a year. Well, actually, a few departments do it once a year. Many officers do it now. They actually have to qualify 4 times a year. And they've had a bunch of training that might allow them to be more consistent. And frankly, there's a lot of evidence that those officers are not at their peak if they only shoot 4 times a year, and some do shoot that infrequently. But so ammunition, practice ammo, I'd like it to be as inexpensive as I can get it that will reasonably function in my gun. Another factor for practice ammunition is if you're shooting at any established range, versus just out on your own property in a woodlot or a gravel pit or something like that. Again, keep in mind, I'm not recommending that you go do that if it's not your property, unless you absolutely know that you're not violating any laws while you're doing it. But if you're going to be choosing any established range, one of the concerns is how much lead we're putting into the environment these days, particularly in the indoor ranges. And they're going to require that you shoot what's called a full metal jacketed cartridge. And what that is the bullet itself is totally encased, well, almost totally encased, in some form of cladding that keeps the lead from being exposed. I say almost because in many cases, even though it's called full metal jacket, the base of the bullet still has exposed lead in it. Some of the companies now differentiate with what they call total metal jacket, TMJ, versus full metal jacket, FMJ. And the total actually is that the base of the bullet is the lead is covered as well. And that just because the burning gases from the gunpowder impact on that lead, exposed lead at the back of the bullet, and they aerosolize that lead. It goes up into the air, which then precipitates back out into a lead dust that the range hopefully is managing. We certainly do at our range. We use a wet floor system machine that has a HEPA filter to come and suck up all that lead, and then it's disposed of. The lead contaminated water is disposed of appropriately. So training ammo, inexpensive, reliable in your gun, not going to damage your gun, and full metal jacket. Carry ammo, duty ammo, self-defense ammo is really what we're, different names for the same thing. In that case, I want the ammunition to be as effective as possible. What's called terminal ballistics. The idea is, quite frankly, how much damage does the bullet do? Is what we're looking at, because again, we're shooting people to get them to stop doing whatever they're doing that is threatening ourselves or someone else with death or permanent injury. How soon do I want them to stop?
Right now.
Yeah, actually a couple minutes ago.
I was going to say before they got here.
Yeah. I wanted to stop right now is the absolute latest I want it to stop. So I want the absolute maximum effectiveness of every projectile that I shoot. So what we're talking about there is the FBI has a testing protocol that they use that they brought out almost 30 years ago now, after a very well-known shootout where there were a bunch of FBI agents. Actually, 3 died, and another 4, if I remember correctly, were seriously injured in this shootout. So they said, we need some standards to define the effectiveness of these bullets. So we're looking at 2 things. How far does it penetrate? The FBI says it should go in at least 12 inches and no more than 18 inches. Why 12? It seems like that's pretty darn deep, right? It's, we want to get to the middle of the body where the important stuff is. And that's certainly less than 12 inches. People aren't 2 feet thick. Well, some people maybe are close to 2 feet thick. But the real issue there is that quite often there's body parts out in front of the important stuff, your arms. The bad guy's arms, if he's threatening you, he's using some kind of tool. If he's pointing a weapon at you, that puts his arms between you and his body, or between your bullet and his body. So that bullet may have to traverse through his forearm, for example, and then exit and go through some air before then going back into the chest and penetrating there. So the FBI decided that in that particular shootout, there was actually a bullet that entered into the forearm, exited the armpit, entered the chest under the arm in the armpit area, and then traversed almost far enough across the chest to hit the heart. And they said, if that had gone just a little bit further, the outcome probably would have been a little bit quicker. And that guy wouldn't have shot so many FBI agents after he suffered his what turned out to be fatal wound, because that's the way that gunfight went down. So 12 inches is what we're looking at, and not more than 18. 18 because we don't want it to come out the other side and keep going, because we're responsible for the final resting place of every projectile that we launch. Second thing is, in order to cause damage at handgun velocities, handgun speeds, the bullet has to touch it. All that stuff you see about temporary wound channel, you can look up the FBI studies on this, and the FBI experts' conclusion is if the bullet didn't touch it, it didn't hurt it. Temporary cavity is nothing more than a temporary stretch in tissues that at handgun speeds doesn't damage the tissue at all. At rifle speeds, that temporary stretch can be so rapid, so fast that it actually tears and damages tissue, just because it gets stretched further than it can stretch, faster than it can stretch. But at handgun speeds, it doesn't happen. So if the bullet didn't touch it, it didn't hurt it. So having that bullet be bigger is better. Yes, we can start with a bigger bullet. We also look at the expansion of the bullet. And typically, expansion these days of most of the top projectiles is nearly 100%. And what I mean by that is a 9mm bullet will end up almost 1.8 centimeters across. Anywhere less than 70% is not a good expanding bullet. It should expand at least 75%, and most of the best ones expand. They basically double in size. So we're creating a larger wound. We're damaging more tissue. Therefore, the bad guy physiologically is incapable of continuing his assault in a shorter period of time for a given placement of the bullet. Obviously, placement of the bullet still trumps everything. Shooting somebody in the foot doesn't cause them to have to quit. It might cause them to want to quit, which would be nice and works just as well, but it is unpredictable. We have no idea of how motivated or insane the attacker is, whether he's going to be influenced by the fact that he has suffered a superficial wound and quit assaulting you, or whether he's going to keep assaulting you until he's unable to continue. So there are a couple of resources that are out there. One of the better resources, in my opinion, is a website that is Lucky Gunner. LuckyGunner.com, spelled just like you think it would be, LuckyGunner.com. And they have some really extensive lists of cartridges that they have put through a testing regime. It differs from the FBI protocol a little bit, just because the FBI protocol is so extensive. It requires so much ammunition and so much ballistic gelatin. They kind of combine some things. And the FBI protocol also is interested for police officers. They need to be able to shoot through things like cars and intermediate barriers, and that's less likely to be as much of an issue for private citizens. But LuckyGunner.com, you can go look up your favorite duty cartridges or self-defense cartridges there, and you'll see a number of factors. They tell you the penetration depth, in a 5-shot average. They tell you, again, with 5 shots, what the average expansion was, what the average velocity was. Give you a lot of hard data, and you can sort it all kinds of different ways and get some ideas there. Now, at the same time, I do encourage you, don't get overly locked into the statistics. If something, if one bullet turns out to be, it expands to 0.68 of an inch, and another one expands to 0.59 of an inch, is that difference really that significant? We really need to kind of look at all of it and balance it. But it's nice to base your thoughts. There's so much marketing hype out there where people come out with these weird new designs and go, this thing is, it corkscrews its way in, and it acts like a food processor blades and chops up the insides and all that. There's places where you can go and actually see what the results really are in some controlled testing. And I encourage you to make your decisions that way. But in summary, you want a modern hollow point design in your self-defense ammunition.
That's going to wrap us up. We're out of time this week. Now remember, if you want more information about the show, go to westcoastarmorynorth.com. Check the About section. Take a look at the show. Any upcoming events as well on their Facebook page. Just check out West Coast Armory North on Facebook. All right, tune in next week right here on Fox Sports 1380 at 9 a.m. on Saturday morning for Thinking Tactically, personal security for today's world. So until next week,
remember to think tactically
and stay safe.